Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. The legal advocacy group ArchCity Defenders has established quite a name for itself, especially since the Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson. The organization is a nonprofit civil rights law firm. It bills itself as combating the criminalization of poverty and state violence against poor people and people of color. ArchCity Defenders was founded less than a decade ago. Late last year, co-founder and then executive director Thomas Harvey announced his resignation. Harvard Law graduate Blake Strode was named to succeed him. He's only 30 years old, is a former tennis pro, and he grew up in St. Louis. Blake Strode joins me in studio. Great to have you with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Does having grown up in St. Louis give you any advantage, do you think, to the job that you have now?
Well, I certainly think it gives me context. This is my home. I've had a lot of experiences here. A lot of my family is here, spread out sort of over the city and county area. And so I think my understanding of the issues in the region is informed by all of those life experiences.
And there are plenty of issues to contend with here, aren't there?
Sure, there absolutely. I mean, we focus, of course, on issues that plague our clients who are overwhelmingly poor and people of color. And so that's, you got our mission statement perfectly there at the outset. We focus on combating criminalization of poverty and state violence that's targeted against those communities.
I have to ask you, most Harvard graduates, law school graduates, go on to big firms and do the money thing, if you don't mind my putting it that way.
Sure.
You opted against that in life. Why?
Well, I went to law school with an idea of the kind of work that I wanted to do, and it was never a private firm path. I was always interested in social justice issues, racial justice issues. I was interested in civil rights. I sort of was brought up in a home where the civil rights struggle was a huge part of kind of the narrative that surrounded me. And so that was always what drove me and what I was passionate about. And it just became a matter of looking for ways to do that and to engage in that work. And so I was very lucky to find a place like ArchCity Defenders.
You and your family have had some firsthand experience with some of the civil rights and social justice issues here in this community, haven't you?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think like many families here, and particularly people of color in this region, I know many people and have many people in my own family and immediate family that have had issues with law enforcement, for example, issues with over-ticketing. My father had an issue where he was trying to get into our home and had locked himself out, and a neighbor called, and next thing he knew, there were police with guns pointed at him, and we were living in Berkeley at the time. And this is something I mentioned this recently in an interview, and I didn't really come to reflect on that incident until much later in life, when I began sort of learning more about law enforcement and how communities of color in particular are policed, and how there's sort of an automatic suspicion that attaches to many people of color and especially men of color. And I certainly think about that incident differently now than I used to, when it was just sort of a strange and concerning story with my father. Now I see it as really a part of this continuum of experiences that many people of color have had here and around the country.
I think of Professor Gates in Boston, same kind of thing when he was trying to get into his own house, and the cops swooped in. So it happens, and it happens fairly frequently. Apparently.
It does. It absolutely does. And I see it as an institutional issue. As you said, it happens fairly regularly. So this isn't really a matter of bad apples or something like that. I have no reason to believe that the officers involved in this incident with my dad that happened many years ago were acting maliciously, but I think there's clearly something in the assumptions that are made and the ways in which people are incentivized to behave within our culture of policing that makes it more likely for something like that to occur with certain people, with black people, than with others.
St. Louis has a reputation for the racial polarization here. and as one of the worst cities in the country. Do you see it that way? And have you seen anything change recently?
Well, I guess I don't know whether it's whether it actually is worse than other places. I do know that we have some statistics on police killings, for example, per capita, and I think St. Louis is first or second on that list. Mm-hmm. And of course, we in recent years have been the focus of a lot of national attention because of the killing of Mike Brown and some other high-profile local police killings. And I think in some ways we are having an explicit discussion that's not being had in other parts of the country. And I think that's a good thing, and I think that's a credit to the people who have taken to the streets, the people who have agitated, the people who have demanded that we talk about race and class and segregation. And so we do that here more than I think some other places that in fact have the same issues. And we have to do a lot more of it because some people just aren't comfortable with those discussions. But it's the only way that we actually can try to move forward and address the structural and institutional racism that plagues us.
As they say, it takes two to tango. And it's one thing to raise the level of consciousness on the streets. It's another thing to have action follow that will correct some of the problems. And that doesn't seem, not much of that seems to have happened since 2014 and Michael Brown's death.
Well, I think you're right about that. I think there was a lot of action, or at least reaction, immediately following the killing of Michael Brown and the Ferguson uprising. And a lot of people were scrambling to try to get their minds around what was happening, why people were so angry, what was sort of underlying a lot of this frustration that clearly had been present for years, for decades. And since then, the urgency seems to have faded. I arrived back in St. Louis in fall of 2015, and even then, there was still a palpable sense that people were reacting. They were reacting to the Ferguson Commission, and the Ferguson Report was being produced at that time, and there were all of these commitments made to honor that report and honor the calls in the report. And now we're in 2018, and I hear a lot less of that.
Yeah. Over the years, I've observed, and you probably have too, that there have been a lot of studies and a lot of reports that have been issued on the situations, the kinds of things that we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. And there's an initial reaction where there is some conversation, then the report gets tossed in a drawer. The drawer is shut, and life goes on pretty much as it had been.
Yeah, and it's funny because I can think back to 2015, hearing a lot of people saying, we're not going to do that. You know, this isn't going to be that kind of situation where we do all of these, public hearings and discussions and reports, and then we go back to business as usual. And sure enough, here we are in 2018. And I think a lot of people feel the way you do, that that's exactly what happened. And we now have on multiple levels, on the local level, we have lots of pushback by local court administrators and police officials about the reforms that were called for at the time. On the state level, we have a state senator proposing to do away with certain parts of Senate Bill 5, which changed the way that municipal courts operate. And then, of course, on the federal level, we have our new attorney general rescinding a guidance letter that changed some of those rules. So it's a multi-level, I think, attack on even the modest changes that were made in the wake of Ferguson.
Yeah, the whole process has not gotten a lot of help from the state legislature.
No, I would say that's true.
We're talking with Blake Strode, who is the new executive director of ArchCity Defenders. We have to take a break. We'll do that now. Come back and continue the conversation. If you'd like to be a part of it, we'd love to have you call in. 382-8255 is the number. That's 382-TALK. You can send us an email at talk@stlpublicradio.org, or if you would prefer, send us a tweet at STL On Air. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU. Welcome back to our conversation with Blake Strode, the new executive director of ArchCity Defenders. Blake, what do you see? You're relatively new in this job, just a couple of months. What do you see as the biggest challenge facing ArchCity Defenders at the moment?
Well, I think we touched on it in part. I think there's a lot of pushback happening to what was a brief period of real energy behind making systemic change in the region, and now what we see are the forces of the status quo are sort of re-entrenching themselves. And I think our fight on things like debtors' prisons and fines and fees is just going to get harder. I think that the status quo in policing in the region has also really dug in, and fights on things like excessive force and police misconduct and unlawful arrests are just going to get harder. And there's support from the federal government for anything goes approach in law enforcement. I mean, explicit statements by the president that you can rough somebody up a little bit when you're arresting them. I think all of that has a cultural impact. And it makes the lives of our clients that much harder every day. It makes their experiences that much worse, and it makes the fight that much tougher.
Do you look for any kind of meaningful change with the appointment of a new police chief in St. Louis?
Well, it remains to be seen, I think.
Yeah.
I was concerned by comments that were made, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, about how there's going to be focusing in certain communities on low-level ordinance violations, on no registration, on improper plates as a means of ticking up the police presence in those neighborhoods. Our experience has been that that's precisely the wrong approach, that actually leads to criminalizing people for their poverty. It leads to highly racialized policing and over-incarceration. So we're going to have to be very mindful of the kind of rhetoric that's being used, and the kinds of policy that attaches to that rhetoric, because I am concerned about that.
You know, I read with interest recently kind of a to and froing between you and the new public safety director, Jimmy Edwards, on the issue of black-on-black crime. What is your concern with what he had to say on Martin Luther King Day about that?
Well, one concern was that he took the opportunity of Martin Luther King Day to make this particular point. I think I know that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the great truth tellers in our history about structural racism, about institutional violence. He understood context, and to scapegoat black people in St. Louis on that occasion just seemed to me to be really improper. It seemed to be the wrong occasion to make that kind of a point. But beyond that, I also think it's just wrong. I think it's misleading. He said something to the effect of "that's on us" or "that's on you," speaking to black people in St. Louis. And I think that lets everyone off the hook too much. It's not on any one group of people in St. Louis, and it's certainly not on black people alone. Black people did not create the conditions in which they live. They didn't create the institutions that led to distressed neighborhoods and joblessness and substance abuse. Those aren't the sort of personal responsibility narrative that goes with that. I think it's just misleading, and it actually is all of our responsibility to do something about those conditions.
Well, there's a numbers game involved with that, too, which a lot of people are referring to. We have some calls, and Joe, calling from St. Louis, may get into that part of this particular piece of the discussion, so let's bring him in. Joe, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. First of all, I want to compliment the person, Blake, who's on there, in just his whole demeanor and his thoughts when he's talking. He seems to be looking at every angle of the situation, which I think is really good. Reasonable, thoughtful comments were made. One thing I wanted to say, though, Don, was that you said something about St. Louis, and I'm paraphrasing you, being the most polarized city in the country, or one of the most polarized. Mm-hmm. And what I think is a little danger, and then Blake said something about, well, I don't know about that, which was good, because I don't know what study was that based on. And then he mentioned you can look at police shooting per capita or different, studies. But first of all, I think St. Louisans are often really a little too hard on ourselves. Certainly we have problems here that need to be addressed. But the other thing is, I think you almost need to take whatever data you're looking at and then combine it with the greater metropolitan area, include St. Louis County. Perhaps per capita police shootings for the city of St. Louis might be higher, or the highest, I don't know, in the nation. I really don't know what it is. But if you compare it with the greater metropolitan area, then it maybe falls a bit more in a norm with other areas. You know what I'm saying? And you hear that a lot when we're mentioned as a dangerous city, and then the leaders come out and say, well, you have to look at that statistic and realize it might be skewed by the number of people in our political subdivision here. And I was pleased that, Blake, you didn't just jump on the bandwagon with that comment, and said, just said what you did. And I think it's important to look at all the data.
Joe,
thanks a lot.
Thank you for the call, Joe.
And good luck in your new position.
Thank you.
Numbers can be a problem. They can be
sure.
interpreted differently in different ways.
Yeah, and thank you for the compliments, first of all. I hope you don't take them back in this response. Because I think you do make a good point. And I think part of what you are pointing to is a structural reality that we have here in St. Louis that has created very concentrated poverty, concentrated violent crime. We know and can predict where it will happen and who it will impact. And that also is our doing. That's the result of collective efforts to create the region as it exists today. And we all, anyone who lives here knows you can drive 20 minutes in one direction and be in beautifully manicured subdivisions, plenty of jobs for people who live there, fresh food options, really lovely places to live. And you can drive 20 minutes in another direction and be in really distressed communities with abandoned properties and higher rates of crimes and lack of jobs and opportunity and higher substance abuse, rates of substance abuse, et cetera. And the race of the people in that first community are going to be overwhelmingly white, and the race of the people in the second community are going to be overwhelmingly black. And that's something we have to look at as being constructed. There's a sort of a willingness by some to say, well, what did those people do to land themselves there? And I think that's precisely the wrong question. The right question is, what did we do that we created a situation where you could predict things by race that accurately? And that's the question. That's the type of question we really try to tackle in our work.
I think of the For the Sake of All report that was put out by Jason Parnell and his colleagues. And one of the most striking numbers that was presented there was the fact that in almost adjacent zip codes, you can have an 18-year disparity in lifespans between, and basically we're talking about the poor neighborhoods and the more affluent that you just suggested.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very, very disturbing. Back to the phones. Let's bring in Ron calling from St. Louis. Ron, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Yes, as a person that works with a lot of youth, and I look at the problems with the criminal justice system and the problems in St. Louis, and one of the things that I would see is, number one, is always relates to jobs. And then we also have to look at the home. We need better home training some of these young people. When you look at any statistics, it tells you if a child is going to end up with a felony conviction, typically there's no parent, no father at the home, and maybe no mother. They typically can't read past the 8th grade level by the time they're 14 or 15. And if you go to almost any prison in the United States, and this covers African Americans, Hispanics, and whites, those are the major predictors of whether they're going to end up with a felony conviction in a state or a federal institution. So we have to do a better job of prevention. And in relationship to tickets and fines, people get tickets and fines, they should be paid, but the amount should be reduced greatly, and they should always have an option of doing community service. But we must reduce crime in some of these communities if we want them to thrive economically.
Thanks for the call, Ron.
Yeah. So I agree with a lot of what you said, Ron. I think part of what you're pointing to is context, that context informs what we understand to be crime, that crime doesn't sort of exist in a vacuum, that it's socially created. There's this term criminogenic, which suggests that there are conditions which we can then accurately predict will lead to more crime. And that's where the priority, in my view, should really be on funding social services, should be on social investment instead of punishment for people who have predictably landed in a scenario where they're in criminogenic environments. And to the second point about fines and fees, I think you're also right that we should take into account people's ability to pay fines and fees as they're assessed, and when there is no ability to pay. So frankly, most of the people we represent, and my predecessor Thomas Harvey was always fond of saying this, there's no amount of fine that could be effective in sanctioning them into being able to correct that behavior. If the problem is you can't afford car insurance, there's no fine that's going to make you be able to afford car insurance. And it's sort of illogical to even think of attaching a monetary penalty to an offense that is rooted in that person's inability to pay in the first place. But that's exactly what we do. And we do it in local courts all over this region. And it leads many people to having warrants, time spent in jail, away from their families, taking parents out of the home, to your point, Ron, and really creating and exacerbating a lot of the very social problems that created the problem in the first place.
And Thomas Harvey has gone on to work on the system, the bail system,
That's right.
a national project actually, which trying to revise that to the point where people don't have to be stuck in jail or prison for extended lengths of periods of time.
That's right.
That's
yeah.
period of time. What can ArchCity Defenders do about any of this? I understand what you do with regard to, helping people, legal advocacy, and helping them, within the criminal justice system. But you're helping what some might call victims here. It's not changing the system, or is it, or can it?
Well, I'd like to think it is. So there's really 4 areas of our work. One that you're pointing to is the direct representation and sometimes direct criminal defense piece, that we are sort of doing triage for people who are in that crisis situation of facing charges, of having been criminalized for their poverty, and trying to resolve those cases, abate fines or reduce fines, or get cases completed with community service, all sorts of things on the direct representation front. But then we also engage in systemic litigation that attacks many of these practices and systems that are creating these problems for our clients. And we also engage in policy advocacy to try to change some of the rules. A lot of what we've talked about today are just the structures and rules that were set up to create the conditions in which people find themselves. And then the last area is through collaboration with our partners. And we're fortunate to have some really great community partners, community organizations, advocates in this region that have been on the ground doing this work for years. And we know that these aren't primarily legal problems. The legal problems are a piece of it, but there are social problems, there are problems of poverty, there are political problems, and so we partner with other advocates in order to have a more multi-pronged approach.
Another caller, Gregory, joins us from St. Louis. Gregory, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Yes. How you doing? How you gentlemen doing today?
Great.
Doing well.
Yes, I had a question. I live in the city of St. Louis, and I've been a first-time felony since 1998. And I know that Governor Nixon had passed a law back in 2016, but it didn't go into effect until 2018, January the 1st, about first-time felonies, nonviolent offenders would be made easier to get their felony conviction expunged. And I've been trying to get in contact with different defense attorneys and different law officers, and nobody was willing to take that case as far as trying to help me or help individuals try to get their nonviolent felony affirmed. I was just wondering if your office is kind of handle stuff like that.
Yeah, so I'm sorry I forgot your name, but Gregory. I would invite you definitely to reach out to our office. Of course, I can't guarantee I can tell you we always get a lot more applications for our services than we can take clients, but I would encourage you to reach out to our office and let us know what the legal problem is. I do know that the expungement law was changed, as you said, I think in 2016. I don't know all of the details of that law, but this is, of course, a really important issue that you're pointing to, which is that collateral consequences attach lifelong to felony convictions and can really impact a person's life in jobs, in housing, in access to public funds in all sorts of different ways. And so, of course, this is a really important issue. It is an issue that we do work on, and you're, of course, welcome to reach out to us and apply.
Let's bring in Bill in Creve Coeur. Make it quick, Bill, if you would, please. We're running out of time.
Absolutely. Is there a way that individuals can become involved? It seems like it's limited to attorneys in terms of being able to help in the community.
Sure. So there's a number of ways. Of course, we always welcome people to support our organization. We survive in part on the generosity of supporters, and you can find more information about that at our website, archcitydefenders.org. But in terms of being involved in the advocacy piece, we're part of what I pointed to was collaboration with partners. We're engaged in a number of projects and campaigns right now with other partners, and always looking for volunteers and looking for, and you don't have to be a lawyer in order to volunteer. And if that's something you'd be interested in, I would also encourage you to reach out to us, and we can find ways to sort of plug you in as you would like.
Very quickly, time's running away. What are the criteria that you use in selecting your clients?
Well, it's somewhat complicated. We have referral relationships with certain social service providers in the area. The only criteria really for our direct services is that we provide attorneys to people that wouldn't be able to afford attorneys otherwise. So there's no strict criteria beyond that really, but we really try to prioritize people who would be in dire straits without our services.
Okay, I can't believe this called DDS. Where did you go to high school? It's a St. Louis thing.
I went to Pattonville, Pirates, proud pirate.
All right, now we know. The burning question of the day. Blake Strode, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Good luck to you in the job with ArchCity
Thank you very
Defenders.
much.
Good to have you. Archived versions of past St. Louis On the Air programs are available for download or podcast at stlpublicradio.org/STLonair. St. Louis On the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio 90.7 KWMU. Thank you for listening. I'm Don Marsh.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.